Hi guys, tonight we're going back to the Eastern Front during the winter of 1941-42, a season so brutal that even the most disciplined German soldiers began to falter. This is not the story of battles and charges, but of the slow, creeping grip of cold that seeped into every layer of clothing, every ration, every thought. But before we begin, if you're someone who loves slow, curious dives into forgotten worlds, tap the like button, subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to get to know my viewers better. It's about a winter that didn't just challenge them, it broke them. The snow had been falling for days without pause, fine powder carried by a wind that cut like glass against the skin. At first, the men had tried to keep track of the days, scratching marks in notebooks or on the buttstocks of their rifles, but the calendar quickly became meaningless. Out here, time was measured not by the clock, but by the endless cycles of freezing nights and gray, dim days. The air was so dry that every breath felt sharp in the lungs, and the cold was a presence you could feel pressing in from all sides. Their boots, meant for autumn mud, were stiff and cracked from frost, the thin wool socks inside frozen stiff by morning. Many had taken to sleeping with their boots on, not out of readiness for a fight, but because taking them off meant risking never getting them back on again. The front line was a maze of shallow trenches and half-collapsed dugouts, the earth too frozen to dig deeper. Snow drifted into every corner, covering rifles, blankets, and the meager piles of firewood that never seemed to last more than a night. Fires were lit rarely, their glow a dangerous beacon for Soviet artillery, so warmth came only from huddling together beneath damp, heavy blankets that smelled of sweat, smoke, and fear. Letters from home, when they came at all, were read over and over until the paper began to tear at the folds. They were the last fragile link to a world far away from this frozen wasteland, a world of warm kitchens, familiar voices, and the idea that spring would eventually come. Some of the men spoke of its spring as if it were a myth, something that existed only in stories told by those who had survived other wars. The officers did their best to keep discipline, but even they could not hide the slow erosion of strength in their voices. Orders were given in clipped, tired tones, the words carrying less force than the wind that scattered them. Every sound out here carried differently in the cold. The crunch of boots on snow was sharp, brittle, like glass breaking, while voices seemed muted, swallowed by the endless white. Hunger gnawed at them constantly. The rations, already small, froze solid before they could be eaten, so bread became a brick to be chipped away with a bayonet, and canned meat turned into a tasteless lump that had to be thawed over a candle flame. Even water was a problem. Snow had to be melted in mess tins, a slow, frustrating process that produced just enough to wet the lips. Sleep was never deep, always interrupted by the ache of cold that crept into the bones no matter how many layers they wore. Dreams, when they came, were often about food, warmth, or the faraway sound of music. But each morning brought the same reality. Another day of standing watch in a world where nothing moved but the snow. Another day where the only enemy more relentless than the Red Army was the winter itself. The days blended together, each one marked by the same pale light that never seemed to brighten, as if the sun itself had given up on this part of the world. The horizon was a smudge of white and gray, the land and sky merging into one endless expanse, making it impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. For the soldiers, this sameness was almost worse than combat. It eroded the mind, dulled the senses, and left them drifting through time as though caught in a slow-moving current. Conversations, when they happened, were short and quiet. Voices kept low out of habit, though there was no one close enough to hear. Even the usual banter that soldiers clung to in better times had faded. There was little left to joke about when your fingers burned from cold, just trying to button your coat. Some men took to rubbing their hands together constantly, not for warmth, but because the motion was something to do, a reminder they were still alive. The silence was never complete. There was always the faint sound of wind, the soft hiss of snow shifting across frozen ground, and now and then the distant thud of artillery. a reminder that war hadn't truly paused for the season, only slowed. At night, the cold seemed sharper, more personal, as though it were a living thing pressing itself into the dugouts and testing the will of every man inside. The stars were hard points of light in a black sky, beautiful in a way, but they offered no comfort. Sleep came in fits, often interrupted by the need to stamp feet or shake hands to keep the blood moving. Sometimes a man would wake in the darkness and hear another breathing shallowly beside him, the sound thin and uncertain. In those moments, there was a shared understanding that no one spoke of. Some might not see the morning. Supplies were scarce, and the long supply lines meant that when food did arrive, it came in fits and starts. There were days when men scraped frost from the inside of their dugout walls to melt for water, and others when they went without entirely. Tobacco, once plentiful, had become a rare commodity, and the thin paper-wrapped cigarettes were hoarded like treasure, lit slowly to savor every last curl of smoke. On the rare occasions when a fire could be made, the men gathered close, eyes half closed in brief relief, as heat reached their faces. But the fires never lasted long. Wood was too precious, too hard to find in a land where even the trees seemed to hunch against the cold. Letters were still read, though fewer now, and some soldiers began writing to people they barely knew, just to have something to say, something to imagine beyond this frozen horizon. It was in those small acts, sharing a crust of bread, offering a sip of melted snow, speaking softly in the darkness, that they found the only kind of strength left to them, the kind that could survive when everything else was stripped away. Morning came not with sunlight, but with a faint shift in the shade of the sky, a dim gray that signaled another day had begun. The cold was the first thing each man felt upon waking, a sharp, biting presence that seemed to settle in the joints and cling to the skin no matter how many layers they wore. Frost formed on the inside of their breath-warmed shelters, delicate white crystals on canvas and wood, and when a man shifted in his sleep, they fell like tiny flakes of snow onto his blanket. Crawling out of the dugouts was an exercise in willpower. The air outside felt colder than inside, though in truth there was little difference. Every step on the frozen ground sent a jolt up through the legs, and the sound of boots crunching in the snow seemed louder in the stillness. The weapons they carried were sluggish in the cold, bolts stiff with frost, oil thickened to the point of near uselessness. Men had learned to keep their rifles close, even tucking them under their coats when they could, not for readiness against the enemy, but to prevent the metal from freezing solid. In the distance, the faint outlines of Soviet positions could sometimes be seen through the drifting snow, though days could pass without any real movement. When the fighting did come, it was brief and brutal, short bursts of rifle fire, or the sudden crash of mortars, before silence returned, heavier than before. Food was a ritual as much as a necessity. A small tin of meat, a hard lump of bread, perhaps a few frozen potatoes if they were lucky. These were passed around in silence, the men eating slowly as if dragging out the moment could make the meal larger. The bread had to be held close to the body before it could be bitten, and even then it crumbled into dry, cold chunks in the mouth. Water came from melted snow, often tasting faintly of smoke, or the metal of the tin it was boiled in. The endless white landscape had a way of playing tricks on the mind. Men swore they saw shapes moving in the distance, or flashes of color where there could be none. Sometimes it was just the wind catching loose snow, or the glint of ice under a weak sun, but other times it seemed real enough to make a man pause, staring out across the fields until his eyes watered from the cold. The nights were worse. Darkness came early, and with it the deep, penetrating cold that made even breathing feel like work. Men huddled together for warmth, their bodies stiff and cramped in the narrow spaces, and still the chills seeped in. Some muttered in their sleep, speaking in half-formed sentences, calling names that others didn't recognize. A few began keeping small talismans close. A photograph, a ring, a scrap of cloth, things that reminded them there was a world beyond this frozen front. The war here was not measured in battles won or lost. but in the slow endurance of men against an enemy that never rested, never relented, and showed no mercy, the winter itself. By midwinter the men had stopped counting the weeks. The cold had erased the usual sense of time, replacing it with a simpler rhythm. Endure the night, survive the day, repeat. The landscape never changed. Endless snowdrifts and skeletal trees that stood like blackened sentinels against the pale horizon. Even the sky seemed reluctant to shift, lingering in that constant gray that dulled the mind. The only motion came from the wind, carrying snow in low, twisting patterns across the ground, filling in footprints almost as soon as they were made. Standing watch in these conditions was a trial few could face without slipping into a kind of waking trance. Men would stamp their feet, flex their hands, and force themselves to scan the empty fields. But the monotony pressed in, numbing both body and thought. It was dangerous, too easy to drift into a daze and miss the subtle signs of movement in the distance. Still, most nights passed in silence, the enemy as subdued by the cold as they were. The rations had grown even smaller. A thin soup, barely warm, might be all a man had for the day. Sometimes frozen turnips were added, but more often it was just water flavored faintly with meat or cabbage, the steam rising briefly before vanishing into the air. Hunger became a constant, gnawing companion, one that wore at patience and made tempers short. The smallest disputes, over a place by the fire, a thicker blanket, a scrap of bread, could flare into arguments, though they just as quickly burned out, too costly in energy to sustain. The cold did more than bite at skin and freeze fingers. It crept into the mind. Thoughts became sluggish, memories harder to hold on to. Some men spoke less and less, retreating into themselves as though saving their strength. Others tried to keep spirits up by telling stories of home, of warm kitchens, of green fields, of summer air heavy with the smell of rain. But the words felt like they belonged to another life. When letters came, they were read in silence, the reader's eyes scanning the familiar handwriting over and over, trying to draw some warmth from it. When no letters came, men invented them in their heads, imagining what a wife or mother or sweetheart might say if they could write. The dugouts smelled of damp wool, unwashed bodies, and smoke from the occasional fire. Every surface was coated in a fine layer of frost, even the wooden crates used as tables. When the rare order to move came, it meant hours of trudging through deep snow, each step a slow lift and push that drained the legs. The air was so cold it burned the throat, and men learned to pull scarves or rags across their faces, breathing through the fabric to take some of the bite away. Nights were the hardest, but mornings could be crueler. Waking stiff and cold, knowing the day ahead would offer no real relief, only another stretch of survival against the frozen front. The wind had a voice out here, a low, constant moan that threaded through the trees and over the ridges, carrying with it the scent of ice and distant smoke. At times it sounded almost human, like the murmuring of someone just out of sight, and the men would glance toward the sound before reminding themselves it was only the weather. Snow fell in every possible form, fine powder that stung the eyes, heavy wet flakes that clung to clothing, and sharp, wind-driven crystals that seemed to pierce the skin. It piled on the roofs of the dugouts, pressed against the entrances, and filled in any path they tried to clear. The more they shoveled, the more it returned, as if the land itself wanted to erase their presence. The weapons they carried became liabilities in such conditions. Metal froze to bare skin, and a careless touch could tear flesh. Ammunition was kept close to the body to prevent it from freezing, though this meant carrying extra weight under layers already heavy with ice. Even the simplest task, cleaning a rifle, tying a strap, was slowed to a crawl by numb fingers. Communication between positions was done in short bursts. A runner would trudge out, hunched against the wind, disappear into the white, and return hours later, his eyelashes rimmed with frost, delivering a message that could have been sent in seconds during warmer months. Sometimes the orders seemed pointless, patrols through empty fields, shifting a line a few meters forward, but the routine kept them from slipping entirely into stillness. The men were learning that in winter warfare, movement was as much about survival as strategy. Fires, when they were possible, became small sanctuaries. The glow was weak, the heat fleeting, but for a few minutes they could feel their faces again, their hands loosening from their rigid curl. Someone might pull out a tin of coffee grounds, long hoarded, and brew a bitter, smoky drink that tasted like luxury. In those moments, they were not soldiers but simply men, sharing warmth in a place where warmth was rare. At night, the cold pressed closer. Frost crept over blankets, and the dugouts filled with the sound of quiet shivering. The dark made the cold feel heavier, as though the absence of light deepened its grip. A man might dream of summer, only to wake with his breath hanging in the air, his body stiff and aching. Sometimes the wind would rise sharply in the night, rattling loose boards and moaning through gaps, and it would sound for all the world like the front itself was alive, watching, waiting. By morning there was no sense of rest, only the continuation of a struggle that had no clear end. This was the winter that stripped away all illusions, leaving only the raw, unending fight to endure one more day. The landscape had settled into a kind of frozen permanence, as if the world had been locked in place by some unseen hand. Trees stood motionless beneath their heavy coats of snow, their branches drooping under the weight, while the ground lay hidden beneath layers so deep that even the thought of thaw felt like fantasy. The horizon was always the same muted line, blurred where the sky met the earth, with no color but shades of gray and white. In this unchanging world, the smallest difference, a faint shadow in the snow, the distant flicker of movement, was enough to draw every eye. Men had grown quiet, their voices rarely rising above a murmur. It wasn't just the cold that kept them silent. It was the knowledge that noise carried far in the still air, and that somewhere beyond the whiteness, the enemy might be listening. Footsteps crunched sharply in the snow, each step a reminder of how brittle everything felt here. The sound was almost too loud, a solitary crack in the vast hush that surrounded them. The daily routines had become rituals of necessity. Weapons were checked again and again, not because they expected to fire them soon, but because letting them sit too long meant frost could seize the moving parts. The meager food was divided with the precision of habit, each man knowing exactly how much he could eat and still stretch his share another day. Water, when it came, was melted snow poured into dented canteens, the heat vanishing almost the moment it was touched by the air. The cold found every weakness in the body. Ears ached under thick layers of cloth, fingertips lost their feeling even through gloves, and skin cracked in thin, painful lines that stung with each movement. A cough could linger for weeks, the sound muffled into scarves so it wouldn't carry beyond the dugout. When a man fell sick, there was little to be done except give him the warmest spot and hope. No one spoke aloud about the ones who didn't recover, but their absence was felt in the way the group shifted, the spaces they left behind in the cramped shelters. At night, when the wind died down, the silence was vast, almost pressing. Lying awake in the dark, a man could hear his own heartbeat, the slow rustle of someone shifting in their sleep, and the distant groan of ice expanding. Dreams came easily in the warmth of memory. Sunlight through leaves, the scent of rain, the hum of summer insects. But waking was always abrupt, the cold a reminder that such moments belonged to another world entirely. Out here, survival meant accepting that warmth and comfort were things of the past, and that endurance, quiet and unglamorous, was the only victory the winter allowed. The cold had a way of making everything feel heavier. The gear on their backs, the air in their lungs, even the thoughts in their heads. Each movement required intention, as if the body needed convincing before it would obey. Marches between positions were slow and exhausting, the snow swallowing their boots to the ankle or higher, forcing them to drag each leg free before taking the next step. The sound of the column moving was a steady rhythm of crunches, punctuated by the occasional grunt or cough, and always underscored by the quiet hiss of wind sweeping over the open ground. The land offered no shelter. What few trees there were stood apart, bare and skeletal, their black trunks stark against the white expanse. The fields stretched out endlessly, broken only by shallow depressions, and the occasional fence half buried in snow. When they stopped to rest, there was no place to sit that wasn't frozen hard, so they stood in small groups, stomping their feet and pulling their coats tighter around them. Their breath hung in the air in pale clouds, drifting upward until it disappeared into the overcast sky. The faces around them were pale and hollow-eyed, cheeks windburned and lips cracked, the lines of fatigue etched deeper with each passing week. The rare moments of warmth were so fleeting they felt unreal. A patch of sun breaking through the clouds, a sheltered corner where the wind was blocked for a minute or two. Even then, the relief was mostly in their minds, as the air was still too cold to truly ease the ache in their bodies. Hunger had grown sharper. Meals were taken in silence, the food disappearing quickly into men too tired to savor it. There were no fresh supplies of bread or meat. Everything came from tins or sacks, the taste dulled by months of storage. They knew how to make it last, half a biscuit now, the other half later, but the hunger never left. In the evenings, when they returned to the dugouts, the snow followed them in, clinging to boots and coats, melting into puddles that refroze by morning. The cramped shelters smelled of damp earth and smoke, the air heavy with the scent of unwashed wool. They spoke less than they once had, conversation giving way to long stretches of silence broken only by the crackle of a small fire, or the sound of someone shifting in their sleep. Outside, the wind carried on without pause, as though the world beyond their line had forgotten what it was to be warm. In this frozen front, the men had stopped wondering when the winter would end. Instead, they focused on the next hour, the next watch, the next morning they might still wake to see. That was enough. The world beyond their narrow stretch of front felt like a distant rumor, something half remembered from another lifetime. The winter had grown even more severe, the air so sharp that every breath seemed to scrape the inside of the throat. Snow fell in waves, thick and steady, erasing the outlines of trenches and dugouts so quickly that it was as though the land itself wanted to hide every trace of them. Digging out had become a daily chore, one that never truly ended. As soon as a path was cleared, the wind would drift snow back into it. Boots were never fully dry, and the constant dampness seeped into socks and skin, bringing with it the numb ache of frostbite that many simply learned to ignore. The sentry posts, built from whatever scrap wood could be scavenged, were lined with frozen cloth to block the wind, but still the cold pressed through as if nothing stood in its way. The rifles leaned in the corners, their barrels sometimes glistening with a thin film of ice that had to be scraped away before they could be fired. Hands, clumsy in thick gloves, worked slowly, each task requiring patience to avoid dropping precious pieces into the snow. Ammunition was kept inside coats or close to the body, not for warmth but to keep it from freezing solid. The stillness of the front was deceptive. Days could pass without a single shot, the silence broken only by the groan of shifting ice, or the dull crack of a branch breaking under snow. Yet every man knew that just beyond the pale curtain of falling flakes, the enemy was enduring the same winter, the same hunger, the same endless fight against the cold. At night the dugouts seemed to close in, their low ceilings pressing down, the air heavy and stale. Lantern light cast soft, uneven shadows across faces, highlighting the hollows of cheeks and the weary set of eyes. Small fires burned low, wood rationed carefully so it would last through the long hours until dawn. Some men wrapped rags around their boots before sleeping, hoping to keep their feet warm enough to avoid waking in pain, while others stuffed newspapers inside their coats to block the wind. The smell of smoke clung to everything: clothing, blankets, even the letters tucked away in pockets. When conversation did happen, it often drifted to memories of food: fresh bread, hot stew, the first cup of coffee in the morning. These talks were bittersweet, warming them for a moment, but leaving an emptiness when the words faded. Outside, the night stretched endlessly, the wind whispering through the trees like an old familiar voice. In the darkness, With the cold pressing in from all sides, the men clung to the simplest truth they had left. To see the next sunrise was victory enough. By late January, the cold felt less like weather, and more like a permanent condition of the earth. The snow had compacted into hard, uneven crusts that crunched loudly underfoot, each step ringing out in the stillness like the crack of dry wood. The wind never truly stopped. It shifted from a steady moan to sudden sharp gusts that lifted fine grains of ice into the air, stinging any skin left uncovered. In those moments, the men hunched lower into their coats, scarves drawn tight, eyes narrowed against the white glare. The sky was a pale, washed-out silver during the day, a hard, brittle black at night. Neither brought warmth. Marches between positions became exercises in endurance, the weight of gear dug into shoulders already sore from weeks of carrying it, and the snow seemed to pull at their boots with every step. Their breath froze in thin crystals on the wool of their scarves, creating a rough, icy patch that scraped against the skin when they turned their heads. Silence accompanied them everywhere. There was no birdsong, no sound of running water, only the crunch of boots and the distant groan of ice shifting in the earth. The dugouts had grown smaller in the men's minds, the same cramped spaces occupied by the same tired faces. Sleep was shallow and restless, each man waking several times to shift, to rub warmth back into his limbs, to listen for noises outside. When someone stirred to add another scrap of wood to the fire, the glow briefly painted the low walls in gold, before fading back to shadow. Supplies arrived less frequently, and when they did, they came in frozen, unyielding blocks. A sack of potatoes that needed hours to thaw, or tins so stiff with ice that knives had to be worked into the seams to pry them open. Meals were reduced to whatever could be prepared with the least fuel, often thin stews or dried bread softened in hot water. Hunger sharpened the senses in strange ways. The smell of cooking, however faint, could draw men from across the camp. Cigarettes had become rarer than gold. Those who still had a few left smoked them slowly, letting the paper burn down to the very tip, savoring every draw. Others improvised with dried leaves or scraps of newspaper, the harsh smoke a poor substitute, but better than nothing. Conversation had dwindled to practical matters, guard shifts, repairs, ration counts. Even jokes felt muted, as though laughter might draw too much energy from bodies already stretched thin. Outside the lines, the land was a featureless expanse. Patrols moved like shadows across it, dark shapes against the white, vanishing quickly into the haze. Encounters with the enemy were brief and brutal. A few shots fired before both sides vanished back into the frozen cover. The war here was as much about patience as it was about force. At night, under the hard stars, the men sometimes imagined they could feel the whole front breathing. Thousands of men on both sides, lying still under the same unending cold. In those moments it didn't matter who wore which uniform, the winter made everyone the same. And with each sunrise, they knew the fight wasn't just to hold ground, but to keep themselves from freezing into part of the landscape they stood upon. February arrived without announcement. No thaw, no change in the quality of the light, just another day in the endless chain of cold and gray. The snow had taken on a life of its own, sculpted into ridges and waves by the wind, forming barriers that made every movement a calculated effort. Even short walks between nearby positions left the men breathless, their chests aching from the cold air, their legs heavy from lifting through drifts that caught and held them. Ice had formed in strange places, along the edges of scarves, on the lashes of men who stood watch too long without blinking, in the hairlines where sweat from a brief exertion had frozen before it could evaporate. The sound of the front had settled into a predictable rhythm, boots crunching in snow, the muffled thud of shovels as men dug out entrances, the occasional distant crack of a rifle or muted boom of artillery. These noises felt almost comforting in their familiarity, a reminder that life still existed beyond the cold. Yet every sound also reminded them of the constant need for vigilance. Dugouts had become more than shelters, they were lifelines. Inside, the air was stale, but warmer than outside. and the men had developed unspoken routines to make the space livable. Wet gloves were hung near small fires, boots propped upside down on sticks to dry, and every scrap of fabric was pressed into use as insulation. The walls were lined with anything that could block the draft: sheets of paper, spare boards, even folded blankets too worn to sleep under. The firewood pile was guarded like ammunition, each piece accounted for, each spark of flame coaxed carefully so it would last just a little longer. Food had become an abstract concept, no longer something to enjoy but simply to endure. The men no longer spoke of meals as breakfast, lunch, or dinner. It was simply something to eat when the chance came. A tin of meat might be shared between 3 men, each taking turns slicing off a frozen piece and holding it close to the fire to soften before chewing. Bread was broken with the same reverence one might show to an irreplaceable artifact. Water required as much effort as food. Snow collected in buckets, melted over a slow flame, and rationed out in small sips. The enemy was rarely seen, but never forgotten. Scouts returned with frost-rimmed beards and eyes narrowed against the wind, reporting shapes in the distance that vanished before they could be approached. Every man knew the Soviets were suffering just as they were, but that knowledge offered little comfort. Endurance was as much a weapon as bullets here. Nights were the longest test. The darkness felt deeper, heavier, as if the cold grew thicker without light to scatter it. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by the need to stamp feet or rub hands to keep circulation going. Dreams of warmth came often: sunlit fields, familiar rooms, the weight of a real blanket. But they dissolved into the reality of the dugout ceiling overhead. In the quiet moments before dawn, the men learned not to think too far ahead. Spring was too distant a promise. Survival meant thinking only of the next hour, the next watch, the next breath, drawn into lungs that ached with the cold. Out here, on this frozen front, each day endured was a small victory carved from the ice itself. The days had begun to blur so thoroughly that only the most significant events, a supply drop, a brief skirmish, a death, stood out in memory. Everything else dissolved into a continuous loop of cold, hunger, and waiting. The sky, always low and colorless, pressed down on the landscape as if trying to squeeze the life out of it. Even the wind had grown slower, not weaker, just moving with the weight of deep winter, its voice lower and more constant as it wound through the bare trees and over the crusted snow. The men had long since stopped talking about the weather. It was no longer an outside condition, but the very air they breathed. Clothing had become a patchwork of repairs and improvisations. Gloves were stitched together from scraps of wool, scarves made from cut-up blankets, and coats layered with anything that could be found. Canvas, burlap, old uniforms scavenged from abandoned positions. Some men tied rags around their legs to block the wind from creeping in under their trousers. Even with these measures, frostbite crept in silently, claiming fingertips and toes, leaving behind a pale, waxy skin that burned when warmed. The medical supplies were never enough, and most wounds, however small, healed slowly in the cold or didn't heal at all. Tasks that would have been simple in another season were slow and punishing now. Clearing snow from an entrance could take an hour, chipping at the frozen layers with shovels and bayonets. Hauling water meant dragging heavy containers back from the nearest melted source, which might be nothing more than a small hole in the ice kept open by constant work. Every movement demanded energy they didn't have, so they learned to ration their own strength as carefully as they rationed food. Meals had become quieter affairs. Men no longer bothered to complain about the rations, knowing it made no difference. A tin of stew was a treasure. A handful of dried peas boiled in snowmelt was acceptable. The taste of smoke from the fires clung to everything, giving the food a bitter edge that no one minded anymore. Cigarettes, when they appeared, were smoked communally, passed from hand to hand in the dugout, each man taking a single drag before passing it along. It was less about the tobacco, and more about the brief sense of sharing something rare. Occasionally, the war would intrude in sharp, violent flashes, a burst of gunfire across the field, the deep, concussive thud of distant artillery. These moments were jarring after such long stretches of quiet, and the silence that followed seemed heavier than before. Patrols returned with snow-frosted coats and reports of nothing unusual, but the knowledge lingered that the enemy was enduring the same conditions somewhere out there. Nights remained the hardest part. The darkness seemed to stretch beyond the hours, creeping into the mind, whispering doubts and memories too vivid to be ignored. Sleep was shallow, filled with uneasy dreams, and waking meant facing the cold all over again. There was no sense of progress, no sign of change, only the slow, grinding passage of time in a world that had forgotten what warmth felt like. On the frozen front, the fight was no longer just against the enemy, but against the creeping thought that spring might never come. The cold had long since stopped feeling like a temporary hardship. It was now an unspoken truth, an ever-present weight that shaped every thought and movement. February deepened without mercy, and the snow underfoot had hardened into a surface that crunched like broken glass with each step. The horizon was nothing but a thin smear of white and gray, and the line between earth and sky had dissolved entirely. Men no longer looked for changes in the weather. There were none. The landscape had frozen into a single moment, and they lived inside it. The dugouts were their only refuge, though calling them shelters was generous. Inside, the air was heavy with smoke and damp, every wall lined with frost, despite the small fires that burned when fuel could be spared. Sleeping was done in layers, wool, canvas, whatever could be wrapped around the body. Yet the cold still found its way in, creeping under collars, biting through gloves, settling deep into the bones. Many slept in their boots, unwilling to risk frostbite in the few minutes it took to put them back on. Mornings were slow and painful. Stiff fingers struggled to fasten buttons or buckle straps, and breath steamed thick in the air as men moved about their cramped quarters. Outside, the tasks were endless: clearing snow from trench lines, repairing collapsed walls, collecting what little firewood could still be found in the frozen ground. Each job drained more strength than it seemed it should, the cold sapping energy faster than food could replace it. Rations had become a quiet obsession. Bread, hard as stone, had to be chipped apart with knives. Thin stews were made from whatever scraps could be boiled together, and sometimes, in the most desperate moments, men chewed on pieces of frozen fat just to feel something in their stomachs. Water was melted snow, faintly tasting of metal from the tins it was boiled in. They ate without ceremony, without conversation, just the sound of spoons scraping the bottoms of mess tins. Patrols were sent out less often now, the risk of frostbite and exhaustion outweighing the need for reconnaissance. When they did go, the men moved slowly across the blinding white, their dark shapes stark against the snow. The enemy was rarely seen, but the knowledge of their presence was constant, a shadow that followed every step. Occasionally, faint gunfire would echo across the fields, only to fade back into the stillness. At night the silence deepened, broken only by the shifting of wood in the fires, or the low murmur of men speaking in their sleep. The stars, when visible, glittered cold and distant, offering no comfort. Dreams came in fragments: warm kitchens, summer air, the sound of rain, and waking from them was like falling into ice water. Out here, hope was measured in hours, not days, and the unspoken agreement among them was simple: survive until morning, and then survive the one after that. The war beyond the cold felt far away, but the winter itself remained close, relentless and unchanging, a foe they faced every moment without rest. The cold no longer surprised them. It had settled into their bones, becoming part of who they were. By late February, the days felt interchangeable, each one marked only by the slow turning of the watch schedule and the measured distribution of rations. The sky hung low and pale, pressing down over the endless expanse of snow. Even the wind seemed weary now, carrying less bite but moving in steady currents that stirred the surface into ghostly veils of drifting powder. Out on the lines, the trenches were half buried in snow, their edges rounded and softened until they looked like natural grooves in the land. Men moved carefully along them, boots crunching over frozen slush, shoulders hunched against the cold. The wooden planks that lined the paths were slick with ice, and each step was a small act of balance. Above, the silence was vast, broken only by the occasional creak of ice in the trees, or the dull snap of something freezing in the distance. Inside the dugouts, life had condensed into a few square meters. Fires, when lit, were small and muted, giving off just enough heat to thaw hands but never enough to make the air truly warm. The smell of damp wool, unwashed bodies and smoke was constant, clinging to every blanket, coat and scrap of cloth. Boots lined the walls, many stuffed with rags in place of proper socks. Men sat close together, speaking rarely, conserving breath and energy alike. Food had become more symbolic than satisfying. A few spoonfuls of thin soup, a slice of bread hard enough to scrape the gums, a sliver of preserved meat. It was enough to keep a man moving, but not enough to quiet the ache in his stomach. They ate slowly, not out of savoring, but because there was nothing else to fill the time. Cigarettes, when they appeared, were lit and passed hand to hand, the thin curl of smoke drifting lazily toward the frost-covered ceiling. Patrols were rare, and when they happened they were slow, careful movements across the empty white. The enemy was like the cold itself, unseen but always felt. Now and then a shot would ring out from somewhere unseen, echoing across the snowfields before being swallowed by the stillness. The men flinched less now. The war's noise was just another sound in the frozen landscape. Nights were long and heavy. The darkness seemed to absorb the small glow of their fires, leaving only shadows and the faint hiss of wind outside. Men lay wrapped in whatever layers they could find, shifting occasionally to ease the stiffness in their joints. Some spoke in their sleep, words too quiet to understand. Others stared upward in the dark, waiting for the faint light of morning. In those hours they didn't think of victory or defeat, only of enduring until the next dawn. The winter had stripped everything down to that single simple goal, and in its own quiet way, it was winning. The world outside had taken on a strange stillness, as if even time had frozen along with the land. The snow lay in deep, unbroken drifts, sculpted into smooth, rounded shapes by the wind, so perfect and untouched that moving through them felt like trespassing. The trees stood motionless, their bare branches sheathed in ice that glimmered faintly under the pale daylight. There was no birdsong, no scurrying of small animals, just the quiet hiss of wind sweeping low across the frozen ground. In this silence, every sound the men made seemed unnaturally loud. The sharp crack of boots breaking the surface of crusted snow, the metallic click of a rifle bolt being eased open, the muffled cough of someone trying not to draw attention. The dugouts had become small islands of survival, their entrances half hidden by snow piled high from days of drifting. Inside, the air was close and heavy, thick with the mingled scents of smoke, damp fabric, and the faint sourness of bodies that had gone too long without washing. The walls were patched with whatever could be found, scraps of wood, torn canvas, even flattened ration tins hammered into place, to block the drafts that crept in no matter how tightly the gaps were stuffed. Firewood was more precious than ammunition. A few sticks could be coaxed into a flickering flame that gave just enough warmth for numb fingers to feel again. But the fire never lasted long, and the cold reclaimed the space as soon as it died. Rations were handed out with quiet precision. A ladle of thin broth, a piece of bread so hard it had to be soaked before eating, perhaps a small slice of dried meat if supplies had been good that week. The men ate without speaking, eyes fixed on their bowls or tin cups, chewing slowly to make the meager portions last. Outside, patrols moved like shadows across the snow, heads low against the wind. The enemy was rarely seen but never forgotten. Distant movements glimpsed through the haze, the faint crack of gunfire somewhere beyond the horizon, the occasional dull boom of artillery that rolled across the white expanse before fading into silence again. These moments were reminders that the war still existed beyond the cold, though the winter often felt like the greater threat. Nights were the true test. Darkness settled over the camp like a heavy blanket, and the temperature dropped sharply, the cold seeping into every corner. Men lay wrapped in their coats and blankets, huddled close together, their breath clouding the air in soft, steady puffs. Sleep came in short bursts, broken by the need to shift position or stamp feet to keep the blood moving. In those hours before dawn, thoughts wandered to warmer places, memories of home, the smell of food cooking, the weight of a real bed. But waking always brought the same unchanging world. On this frozen front, survival had been stripped to its barest form. Endure the night, greet the morning, and do it all again. The snow had grown heavier in recent days, falling in thick, lazy flakes that seemed harmless until they piled into knee-deep drifts. Moving anywhere became a slow, deliberate process, every step requiring effort to lift boots free from the clinging weight. The wind shifted constantly, carving strange patterns into the white, and burying yesterday's tracks, as if no one had ever passed. The landscape no longer felt like open ground, but like a vast frozen ocean, rolling in silent waves of snow. Out here, distance was deceptive. Objects seemed closer than they were, and shapes could vanish into the haze with a blink. Men learned to trust the path under their feet more than their eyes. The dugouts were choked with dampness, their low ceilings beaded with condensation that froze into delicate crystals overnight. Blankets and coats were never fully dry, and the smell of smoke clung stubbornly to everything. A fire, when it was possible, was kept low to avoid drawing attention, and its glow seemed almost swallowed by the cold air inside. Conversations, when they happened, were brief. Remarks about guard duty, a comment on the food, an unspoken acknowledgement of fatigue in another man's face. Food itself had become both a comfort and a frustration. The bread was dense and cold, needing to be thawed near a flame before it could be eaten without chipping a tooth. Stew was often little more than cloudy water, with a few softened vegetables, but even so, men leaned over their bowls, as if guarding something precious. The act of eating had become ritual. Small bites, slow chewing, nothing wasted. Patrols through the snow were draining. Even short distances felt like miles when the wind cut across open ground. Scarves froze stiff from breath, and the frost that formed on eyelashes blurred vision. Each man carried his rifle close to his body to keep the metal from freezing, though the effort added weight to already tired arms. Encounters with the enemy were rare and fleeting. Dark figures glimpsed in the distance, a short exchange of shots, then nothing but the whisper of the wind again. Inside the dugouts at night, the cold was patient, creeping in as fires burned low. Men shifted in their blankets, turning to face the wall, or curling tighter against the chill. Sometimes someone would speak in the dark, telling a story from home or recalling a summer long past, but the words always faded, swallowed by the steady hiss of wind outside. Sleep, when it came, was shallow, interrupted by dreams of warmth that vanished too quickly. Morning brought little relief, only the pale light seeping through the snow-packed entrance, and the slow realization that another day of the same struggle had begun. Out here, on the frozen front, the war felt less like a battle against men, and more like a quiet, relentless contest with the winter itself. A contest that neither side seemed close to winning. By the start of March, there was no sense that winter was loosening its grip. The snow was no longer soft and powdery but hard and crusted, breaking beneath their boots with a brittle crunch. The air felt drier, sharper, as though each breath scraped the throat on its way in. The horizon remained a pale blur, sky and land fused together in a seamless expanse of white and gray. Days passed without any clear change in light or temperature, and the men stopped wondering when the thaw would come. The dugouts had become dim, crowded spaces where the same faces were seen day after day, their features growing leaner, their eyes more sunken. The walls were patched with whatever could be found: planks from broken crates, scraps of cloth, even bits of frozen earth pressed into place, to block the persistent drafts. Firewood was hoarded with care, each piece weighed in the hand, before being placed on the flames. The warmth savored, as though it might be the last. When no wood could be found, men burned scraps of paper or splintered boards, anything that could hold a flame for even a few minutes. Meals were taken in silence, the act of eating reduced to function rather than pleasure. Bread was divided into thin slices, sometimes softened over the fire, but often eaten frozen. A ladle of watery soup was treated as if it were a feast. The smell of cooking, faint though it was, could lift heads and draw silent, longing glances from across the dugout. Outside, patrols moved slowly through the fields, their shapes blending into the snow until they seemed part of it. The enemy was rarely visible, but there were signs of them. Faint tracks, a wisp of smoke far away, the distant echo of a rifle shot. The front was quiet, yet the quiet itself felt tense, as if both sides were waiting for the same inevitable change in weather to move again. Nights were still the hardest. The darkness pressed down heavily, and the temperature dropped until the air inside the dugouts bit at any exposed skin. Men slept in layers of wool and canvas, curled tightly against one another for warmth. Sometimes a man would wake to find frost forming on his blanket, the faint white crystals glinting in the light of a dying fire. Conversation at night was rare. Voices carried strangely in the stillness, and there was nothing new to say. Instead, the silence was filled with the soft sound of breathing, the occasional cough, and the low, distant moan of the wind. Morning brought only the faintest relief, the pale gray light revealing a world that had not changed. The snow, the cold, the endless quiet, it all seemed to have settled into permanence. In the minds of the men, the war was no longer measured by victories or losses, but by the simple, stubborn act of surviving another day on a front where the true enemy never slept and never relented. March moved on without bringing the warmth the men had begun to crave in silence. Each morning felt like the last, the same pale sky stretching endlessly above a frozen world. The snow no longer fell as often, but what was already on the ground had hardened into uneven ridges, the surface glinting with frost under the thin daylight. Every step crunched sharply, the sound carrying far in the still air, as if announcing their presence to anyone listening beyond the horizon. The cold seemed sharper now, more concentrated, finding its way through even the thickest layers. In the dugouts the air was heavy, with smoke from small, careful fires. The walls, patched with scavenged boards and fabric, still let in narrow threads of wind that coiled across the floor like unseen snakes. Men sat close to one another, their shoulders touching, speaking rarely, their faces pale and drawn. Some kept their hands inside their coats at all times, unwilling to expose them for even a moment longer than necessary. Boots were never fully dry. The dampness settled into them and stayed, no matter how long they were propped near the fire. Rations had grown painfully small. Bread was measured in fingers, width, soup in half-filled tins, the contents often no more than cloudy water, with a few softened scraps of vegetable. Meat was almost non-existent, and when it appeared it was sliced into pieces so thin, they barely weighed anything at all. The men ate slowly, as though stretching the moment could somehow make the food last longer. Cigarettes, when found, were smoked down to the very end, the faint glow of the ember, briefly lighting tired faces. Outside the patrols still went on, though each step through the crusted snow was an effort. Scarves froze stiff from breath, and frost gathered on lashes, narrowing vision. Encounters with the enemy remained rare, a glimpse of a shadow moving along the edge of the tree line, the faint pop of a distant rifle, but each sighting was a reminder that the quiet was temporary. Sometimes, in the stillness, they could almost hear movement carried on the wind, though nothing was ever close enough to see. The nights were long stretches of darkness, broken only by the soft hiss of wind over the snow. Fires burned low, the light barely enough to see by. Men shifted in their sleep, pulling blankets tighter, curling smaller to keep what warmth they had. Dreams of summer came often, but faded quickly on waking, replaced by the reality of the cold, pressing in from all sides. Morning brought no change, just another day to endure. The war here had been reduced to its most basic form, not attacks or advances, but the stubborn refusal to be broken by the winter that surrounded them. By mid-March the men had stopped expecting change. The sky remained a dull, unbroken gray, the ground still locked in its thick coat of snow and ice. The wind moved in steady, deliberate gusts, carrying with it a fine dusting of frost that settled on everything. Helmets, rifles, the rough wool of their coats. Even the sound of the wind seemed tired now, a low, constant hum that never faded entirely. Out on the lines, the trenches had narrowed from weeks of drifting snow pressing in, their wooden supports bowed and warped by the weight. Walking them meant brushing shoulders against the icy walls, feeling the cold seep through layers of fabric. The men's movements were slow and deliberate, not out of caution for the enemy, but to conserve the little energy they had. Boots were stiff with frost, the leather cracked from constant dampness, and every step felt like lifting a weight. Inside the dugouts the air was thick and stale. The low ceilings dripped faintly as warmth from small fires loosened the frost overhead, only for the water to freeze again in the night. Men spoke in low voices when they spoke at all, their conversations reduced to the bare necessities of survival: guard shifts, ration counts, and the occasional quiet warning about frostbite. The smell of smoke and unwashed wool was everywhere, seeping into the fabric of their clothes, their blankets, even the paper of letters from home. Food was nearly gone. The bread they received was so dry and frozen that knives had to be hammered into it to cut it apart. Soup, when available, was more water than anything else, its thin steam curling briefly before vanishing into the cold. The men ate quickly, not because they were in a hurry but because pausing between bites allowed the food to cool into something almost inedible. Patrols were rare and short. The land stretched flat and featureless, broken only by the faint shadow of trees or the suggestion of a rise in the distance. Occasionally, movement would flicker on the horizon, too far to identify but close enough to keep every man aware that the enemy was out there, enduring the same frozen misery. Nights were the longest hours. The darkness seemed to press against the dugouts, the temperature dropping sharply as soon as the sun sank. Fires were kept as low as possible, their glow barely enough to light the cramped space. Men curled into themselves, pulling every available layer close, listening to the slow breathing of those around them. Sleep came in short bursts, broken by shifts of guard duty or the simple ache of the cold forcing them awake. Morning brought no relief, just the faint light creeping in through snow-packed entrances, and the realization that another day had begun exactly like the last. Out here the war felt less like a battle between armies, and more like a contest between human endurance and a winter determined to grind it down, inch by inch. Late March brought no thaw, only a subtle shift in the air that hinted at change, but never delivered it. The snow remained thick and unyielding, its surface hardened into a crust that shattered underfoot with each step. The wind moved more gently now, but its cold was no less biting, slipping through every gap in clothing, and cutting against exposed skin. The sky hung low and heavy, a uniform gray that seemed to press down on the land, blurring the line between horizon and clouds. The trenches had grown cramped from weeks of snow narrowing their walls, and moving through them meant brushing against ice-coated boards that stole warmth from a man's side. Boots, still stiff and cracked from months of damp cold, were lined with rags to hold in what little heat they could. Some men wore the same socks for days, knowing they had no dry replacements. The dugouts offered shelter but little comfort. Inside the air was stale, with the smell of wood smoke, damp wool, and the faint sourness of bodies too long without proper washing. Frost still formed on the walls at night, melting only in small patches where the fire's heat reached. The fire itself was kept low and shielded, the wood rationed to last as long as possible. Every ember was guarded like treasure. Food was scarce enough that it no longer felt like a daily certainty. Bread was divided into portions so thin they could be eaten in 3 bites, but men forced themselves to stretch it over an hour, taking small pieces at a time. The soup, when it came, was thin and faintly bitter, its warmth the only real nourishment it gave. On the rare occasion that a piece of meat appeared, it was passed around so each man could have at least a taste. Cigarettes were nearly gone, and those who had any smoked them in silence, drawing out each drag until the ember reached their fingertips. Patrols were kept short. The land beyond the lines was still and empty, the snow's crust broken only by the faint marks of past footsteps. Sometimes, far in the distance, movement flickered, a shadow disappearing behind a rise, or the suggestion of figures moving between trees, but it was never enough to warrant pursuit. The enemy was still there, unseen but constant, waiting for the same change in weather that might bring the war roaring back to life. Nights were long and deeply quiet. The temperature dropped so quickly after sunset that men could feel it in their lungs when they breathed. Fires burned to coals within an hour, and the darkness pressed close, broken only by the faint glow of the embers and the sound of wind passing over the snow above. Sleep came in fits, and men often woke with their blankets stiff with frost. Morning brought only the pale light of another day, exactly like the one before. Out here the war felt less like a series of battles and more like an unbroken sentence, measured not in victories but in the slow, grinding endurance of those who refused to yield to the winter's hold. The final days of March felt endless, the cold clinging stubbornly to the land as if unwilling to let go. The snow had lost its softness, turned to a hardened layer that cracked loudly under every step. The wind was no longer constant, but when it rose, it carried a sharp edge that cut into exposed skin and left cheeks raw. The horizon remained a blur of gray and white, and the sun, when it appeared, was pale and distant, offering no warmth. The trenches were narrow channels between walls of ice, their boards warped and slick from repeated freezing and thawing. Moving along them was slow work, every step measured to avoid slipping. The ground beneath was uneven, frozen solid in ridges that jarred the knees and ankles. Boots, long since worn past their best, were stuffed with extra cloth or paper to block the cold, but the dampness inside them never truly went away. In the dugout, space felt even tighter now, the air thick with the mingled smells of smoke, damp wool and unwashed bodies. Frost clung stubbornly to the walls, melting only in small streaks near the fire. The fire itself was a fragile thing, burning low to make the wood last. Men sat close, their faces lit in flickering orange, hands outstretched to the heat, knowing it would vanish the moment the flames died. Rations were thinner than ever. A few mouthfuls of bread, a ladle of thin soup, perhaps a small piece of dried vegetable, were all that could be expected. Some men ate quickly, swallowing the food in a few bites, while others stretched the process out, nibbling slowly as though it might fool their stomachs into thinking there was more. Water was melted snow, collected carefully and boiled in dented tins, tasting faintly of smoke. Patrols were rare and brief. The land outside was a silent, frozen plain, its surface broken only by the faint shadows of past tracks. Now and then, the enemy's presence could be felt in subtle ways, a distant crack of a rifle, a wisp of smoke far off, but no real engagement came. Both sides seemed content to wait, conserving strength for when the weather finally broke. At night, the darkness felt heavier than ever. The cold deepened quickly after sunset, and the small fires were allowed to burn down to embers. Men lay wrapped tightly in their coats and blankets, huddled together for warmth, their breath clouding in the still air. Sleep came in short bursts, broken by shifts in guard duty, or the slow ache of the cold working into their joints. The hours between midnight and dawn felt like the longest of all, the quiet so complete that the faint pop of ice shifting outside could sound like a gunshot. Morning brought the same dim light, and the same unchanging landscape. The war here was not fought in charges or retreats, but in the simple, stubborn act of enduring each day, waiting for a season that felt further away with every passing week. April arrived without any sign of spring, the cold still holding the land in a grip that seemed unbreakable. The snow had settled into a rough, crusted surface, mottled with patches of ice that caught the light in sharp glints. The air was heavy and unmoving, and the sky, though sometimes clearer now, offered only a weak sun that seemed to shine without warmth. Each breath still stung the lungs, and the dampness that had lived in boots and coats all winter showed no sign of leaving. The trenches were worn and narrow, their sides glazed with ice that made footing treacherous. Boards creaked under weight, and where they had broken, the frozen ground beneath was jagged and uneven. Moving along these paths required care, not from fear of enemy fire, there was little of that now, but to avoid slipping and falling in the bitter cold. The dugouts had grown quieter still. Inside, the air was thick, with the smell of smoke and the faint tang of damp earth. The walls were patched with any material that could be found, yet thin lines of frost still traced their way along the seams. The fire, when lit, was small and carefully tended, the wood rationed down to the last splinter. Men sat close, their movements slow, conserving their strength. Rations had become almost symbolic, a gesture towards survival rather than true sustenance. Bread was thin and dry, soup watery and pale, and any scrap of meat was shared so thinly it could be gone in a single bite. Cigarettes were almost unheard of now, and those who had any left smoked them in silence, the ember lighting their faces for the briefest moment. Patrols outside were kept to a minimum. The snow no longer fell heavily, but its crusted surface made movement loud, the sound carrying far over the frozen fields. Tracks left behind were quickly hardened into place, a map of every step taken. Sometimes distant movement could be seen, dark shapes against the white, but no one approached. Both sides were locked in the same waiting game, saving their strength for when the cold finally broke. The nights were still long, though now there was a faint change in the air that hinted at the season's turn. The temperature still dropped sharply after sunset, and fires burned low to conserve fuel. Men slept curled tightly in their layers, their breath forming pale clouds in the dim light. The silence was broken only by the occasional groan of ice sifting somewhere beyond the lines. In those dark hours, thoughts of home came more often, unbidden and sharp, the smell of soil after rain, the sound of leaves moving in a warm wind, the sight of a field that wasn't buried under snow. But morning always brought the same frozen landscape, the same dull gray sky. On this front, victory was not measured in ground gained, but in the simple fact of waking up still alive, ready to face another day in the endless winter that refused to loosen its hold. The second week of April brought a slight shift in the air, but it was nothing like the relief they had imagined. The cold was still present, biting at the skin and stiffening fingers within minutes, yet there was a faint wetness now, a hint that the snow was no longer as invincible as before. In the afternoons, a thin layer on the surface softened just enough to cling to boots, making each step heavier. By evening, it froze solid again, locking every footprint in place like a cast in ice. The sky had taken on a paler tone, though clouds still hung low and heavy, muting what little sunlight there was. In the trenches, the ice that had clung stubbornly to the wooden supports began to weep in tiny droplets during the warmest part of the day, only to turn back to frost by nightfall. The ground beneath was still frozen hard, but the top layer grew slick, forcing men to tread carefully to avoid slipping. Moving along these narrow paths was a slow process, not from enemy fire. They rarely heard shots now, but from the exhaustion of dragging their tired bodies through terrain that resisted every step. The dugouts remained the center of their world, though they felt smaller with each passing week. Inside, the air was a mix of damp wool, stale smoke, and the faint earthy smell of thawing walls. Frost still clung to the coldest corners, though near the fire it gave way to small patches of dampness that stained the wooden boards. The fires were kept weak, fueled by whatever scraps could be found: broken crates, splintered tools, even bits of old fortifications stripped away for warmth. Food was still scarce. Bread was thin and crumbly, breaking apart in their hands. Soup was pale and almost tasteless, made from the smallest scraps of vegetable or potato, bulked out with melted snow. They ate without ceremony, each man focused only on finishing his portion before it cooled to the point of being unpleasant to swallow. Patrols were few, short, and cautious. The snowfields stretched silent and empty, but every movement was still measured, every sound listened to. Occasionally the distant echo of gunfire reminded them the enemy was still there, equally unwilling, or unable, to move in force. More often the only noise was the low crunch of boots or the sigh of wind moving through bare branches. At night the cold was joined by dampness, a new enemy that seeped into clothing and blankets. Fires were banked low, casting faint light over tired faces. Men huddled together not just for warmth, but against the creeping sense that the winter might never truly end. They spoke little in those hours, the silence punctuated only by the shifting of bodies, or the faint patter of melting frost dripping into buckets. Dawn brought no dramatic change, only the same pale light, the same snow-covered ground, and the quiet understanding that survival still depended on doing tomorrow exactly what they had done today. By mid-April the snow had begun to lose its perfect whiteness, taking on a faint gray tint from the dirt and debris stirred up by weeks of wind. Small patches of bare ground appeared in sheltered spots, but they were more a curiosity than a sign of real change. The cold still clung to the air, sharp in the mornings and settling deep into the bones by nightfall. The wind had shifted in tone. It no longer screamed through the trenches, but whispered steadily, carrying the scent of wet earth beneath the frozen crust. In the trenches, the melting snow made movement more treacherous than before. The top layer softened during the day, turning to a slick slurry underfoot, then froze into uneven ridges as the temperature dropped again at night. Boards laid across the worst sections shifted under weight, sometimes snapping in two. Men moved with care, eyes down, rifles slung to free their arms in case they slipped. The dugouts were damp now, the frost that had coated the walls giving way to beads of water that dripped slowly into shallow puddles on the floor. The air was thick with the scent of wet wool and earth. Fires burned a little stronger, fed with scraps of wood pried from abandoned structures, but fuel was still rationed carefully. Men sat close to the flames, hands stretched toward the warmth, their eyes half closed in relief that lasted only until the fire was allowed to burn down again. Rations had not improved. Bread was still thin and dry, soup still watery and bland. A rare find, half a potato, a small strip of meat, was enough to draw quiet, appreciative glances from those nearby. Cigarettes were almost mythical now. The few that remained were smoked slowly, each drag held for a moment as though it could warm from the inside. Patrols ventured out more often now, though they remained short and careful. The landscape was still mostly snowbound, but the softening surface made movement slower. Tracks left during the day froze solid by night, creating a map of paths that would remain until the next thaw. Encounters with the enemy were still rare, a shadow disappearing over a rise, the faint echo of a shot from somewhere unseen. Nights had changed in character. The deep, biting cold was tempered by a damp chill that seemed to sink through every layer of clothing. Fires were kept going longer now, their glow casting moving shadows across the dugout walls. Conversation returned in small bursts. Short stories, memories of home, murmured speculation about when the thaw might truly come. Yet when dawn arrived, it brought the same pale light, the same flat horizon, and the same knowledge that the struggle here was not yet over. On this frozen front, change came slowly, and each day survived still felt like a victory wrestled from the winter's stubborn grasp. By the third week of April, the snow was retreating in uneven patches, exposing strips of dark, frozen soil that steamed faintly under the weak midday sun. These glimpses of ground felt almost unreal after months of endless white, yet they brought little real warmth. The air was still cold enough to bite at fingers and sting the inside of the nose, especially in the early hours. The wind carried more moisture now, and with it came a damp chill that clung to clothing and crept into the dugouts. In the trenches, the melting snow had turned the ground into a treacherous mix of ice and mud. Boots sank into the softening surface, water seeping in despite every attempt to seal them. Wooden planks, once frozen solid in place, now shifted under weight, sometimes tipping enough to send a man stumbling. The walls dripped steadily during the day, and by evening the water froze again, forming a slick glaze that caught the dim light. The dugouts felt different now. Not warmer, exactly, but heavier, the air thick with dampness. Blankets absorbed the moisture from the ground and walls, making them heavier to wrap around cold shoulders. Fires burned a little brighter, with the extra wood scavenged from collapsed outposts and abandoned shelters, but the heat they gave off never reached far. Men sat close, shoulders touching, hands cupped around tin mugs of hot water or the thinnest of soups. Food supplies were still meager, the bread crumbling at the edges, the soup no more than a faintly flavored liquid. Occasionally, a stray potato or piece of carrot appeared in the pot, and its discovery was met with a subdued sort of gratitude. Cigarettes had all but vanished. Those who had one left smoked it slowly in private, unwilling to draw the attention of longing eyes. Patrols were longer now, testing the edges of the thawing landscape. The snowfields were streaked with dark veins of exposed earth, and movement was easier in some places, harder in others where the meltwater pooled. The enemy was seen more often now, distant shapes moving along a tree line, a brief exchange of shots that broke the stillness before both sides withdrew again. At night the cold no longer felt sharp enough to cut, but the dampness settled deep into joints and muscles. Fires burned low but steady, their light flickering across tired faces. Conversations came more readily than in the depths of winter, but they often ended in long silences, each man lost in his own thoughts. The sounds of the night had changed too, less of the dry hiss of wind over snow, more of the faint drip and trickle of melting ice somewhere beyond the walls. Dawn brought skies that were sometimes lighter, though the ground still held on to its winter coat in stubborn patches. Each morning, the men woke with the same thought. The worst of the cold might be passing, but the war, and the waiting, were far from over. By late April, the snow was no longer an unbroken sheet but a patchwork of white and dark earth, the ground emerging in uneven stretches as if waking slowly from a long sleep. The air carried a different weight now, still cold in the mornings but edged with a faint softness that hadn't been felt in months. The wind, though still biting at times, no longer cut so deeply, instead bringing with it the scent of wet soil and distant pine. Yet for all these changes, the trenches remained treacherous. Meltwater pooled in low spots, turning the once frozen ground into a slick, sucking mud that clung to boots and made every step a strain. Boards laid to bridge the worst sections shifted and sank, splashing dirty water over trousers already stained from weeks of wear. The walls, dark with moisture, shed steady droplets during the day, and by night those drops froze into thin, glassy beads. Inside the dugouts, the damp had become an enemy as persistent as the cold had been. Blankets and coats felt heavier, holding the moisture from the air, no matter how close they were kept to the fire. The fires themselves were better now. Wood was easier to find as the snow receded, but the smoke lingered longer inside, filling the low ceilings with a haze that made eyes sting and throats scratch. Men lingered around the flames, cups in hand, drawing out the meager warmth as long as possible. Rations had not improved much. Bread came in softer now, but was spotted with dampness from storage. The soup, while still thin, sometimes held a few more pieces of vegetable or grain. On rare days, a small piece of cured meat made its way into the pot, and the smell alone lifted spirits for an hour. Cigarettes remained nearly non-existent, but tea leaves scavenged from old stores were sometimes brewed into a weak, bitter drink that was passed around the dugout. Patrols covered more ground now, tracing paths along the edge of the thawing fields. The snow was softer, harder to move quickly across, and the dark patches of earth stood out sharply against the pale remnants of winter. The enemy was visible more often, figures moving in the distance, brief flashes of light on metal, but there were still no major clashes. Both sides seemed content to watch and wait. Nights were no longer silent. The slow drip of water from melting ice punctuated the steady breathing of sleeping men. The cold still crept in after sunset, but it was a damp chill rather than the sharp bite of winter, and some men found themselves sweating under too many layers. Dreams came easier now, though they were often interrupted by the shifting of a comrade or the creak of thawing wood. Morning light spread more quickly across the horizon, pale but persistent, hinting that the season might finally be ready to change. Yet in their minds, the men knew that the hardest days were not necessarily behind them. The cold had tested them, but what came next? The movement, the fighting, would test them in ways winter never could. The first days of May brought a strange mix of relief and unease. The snow was retreating quickly now, leaving behind wide stretches of sodden earth and tangled roots that had been hidden for months. Pools of meltwater reflected the pale sky, and every step in the trenches splashed mud up the backs of trousers. The air was heavier, carrying the smell of thawing ground and damp wood, but it also seemed to press harder on the lungs, as if the long months of cold had made breathing in warmer air an unfamiliar effort. The wind had changed too. It no longer stung, but it carried an unpredictable edge, sweeping across the open ground with sudden gusts that rattled loose boards and sent ripples through shallow puddles. In the trenches, movement was slower, not because of ice but because of the thick, sucking mud that clung to boots. Every step threatened to pull a man's foot free of its worn leather, and the narrow paths had become uneven channels of water and muck. Planks were laid across the worst of it, but they shifted dangerously under weight, and a wrong step could mean sinking to the ankle or deeper. The dugouts were warmer now, but the warmth brought dampness that was no less punishing than the frost had been. The walls sweated with moisture, and the ceilings dripped steadily, soaking blankets and supplies. Fires were kept burning longer, fueled by wood gathered from collapsed structures and uprooted posts, but the smoke often hung low inside, making eyes water and lungs ache. Rations were much the same, bread now soft but prone to molding quickly, soup still thin, though more often flavored with vegetables. When a rare piece of meat appeared in the pot, the smell drew men from across the camp, their faces brightening for the briefest moment. Water came from the runoff, collected in buckets, filtered through cloth to catch the debris before being boiled. Patrols extended farther now, the thaw making it possible to cross ground that had been impassable in winter. The landscape was a patchwork of mud, slush, and stubborn snowdrifts clinging to the shade of trees. The enemy's presence was clearer too, smoke from small fires, distant figures moving along ridgelines, the sharper crack of rifles now and then. Skirmishes were still rare, but the tension had returned, humming beneath the quieter moments. Nights had changed most of all. The cold no longer dominated, but the damp settled in like a second skin. Men slept lighter, their rest broken by the sounds of dripping water, the rustle of wet fabric, and the occasional distant call of a bird. A sound so foreign after the silence of winter that it woke some in surprise. Morning light came earlier and lingered longer, revealing a landscape that was shedding its icy armor one slow patch at a time. But with the thaw came the awareness that the season of stillness was ending. The snow had been its own kind of enemy, But what waited beyond it, the movement, the mud, the renewed fighting, would demand a different kind of endurance. The men knew it, even if they didn't say it aloud. By the second week of May, the transformation of the land was undeniable. The last stubborn patches of snow clung to shaded corners and deep ruts in the ground, but most of the white had been replaced by a deep, wet brown. The earth, long locked in ice, had softened into thick mud that swallowed boots to the ankle and held on like a living thing. Water pooled everywhere, at the bottoms of the trenches, along the paths between positions, and in the open ground where the meltwater had no place to drain. The air was warmer, yet heavy with moisture, carrying the smell of wet soil, rotting leaves, and the faint tang of rust from soaked equipment. In the trenches, movement had become a battle of its own. Each step required effort, the mud sucking at the soles of boots, the slippery boards laid for footing shifting and tilting under weight. Rifles had to be kept high and dry, as a slip into the muck could ruin them. Clothing was perpetually damp now, the lower legs caked in mud that dried into stiff layers only to be soaked again the next day. The dugouts, freed from the constant frost, were now plagued by damp and decay. The walls glistened with moisture, and the smell inside had shifted from the sharp scent of cold earth to the mustiness of wet wood and mold. Fires burned hotter now, and wood was easier to gather, but the smoke still lingered in the still air, curling into every corner. Men huddled around the flames more for the comfort of light than for warmth, their faces lined from the long winter but carrying a faint restlessness as they felt the season turning. Rations were little changed, bread softer now but prone to spoiling quickly, soup still thin though flavored with more vegetables as supplies trickled in. A rare piece of meat was treated with near reverence, shared evenly and eaten slowly. Water came directly from melt pools, strained and boiled, tasting faintly of the earth it had seeped through. Patrols were longer, ranging into areas that had been unreachable in the snow. The thawed ground revealed things the winter had hidden, broken equipment half buried in mud, collapsed shelters, and here and there the grim shapes of those who had not survived the cold. The enemy was more visible now too, small groups moving across open ground, smoke from cooking fires rising in the distance, the occasional sharp exchange of gunfire before both sides disappeared again. Nights were softer but no less uncomfortable. The damp settled into blankets and clothing, making sleep a restless, sticky affair. The soundscape had changed, the constant hiss of wind over snow replaced by the drip of water, the sucking squelch of mud underfoot, and the occasional call of a bird. Dawn came earlier and brighter, spilling pale gold light over a landscape that seemed both alive and wounded. The men felt a change in their bones. The frozen front was gone, but in its place had come a new battlefield, one that would demand as much grit and endurance as the winter had, and perhaps even more. By mid-May the thaw was complete. The snow had vanished except for a few thin streaks clinging to shaded hollows, and the ground was a churned expanse of mud, water, and debris. The earth, freed from its frozen shell, had turned soft and treacherous, swallowing boots with each step and releasing them only with a loud, sucking pull. Water collected in every depression, and the trenches had become narrow canals of brown slush, the boards underfoot slick and shifting with the weight of men crossing them. The air was warmer now, but heavy with dampness, carrying the rich, almost overpowering smell of wet soil mixed with the sourness of decay. In the trenches, movement was no longer slowed by the cold, but by the weight of mud clinging to every piece of equipment. Rifles needed constant cleaning to keep the grit out of their actions, and uniforms were perpetually stained from the knees down. The walls of the dugouts wept with moisture, and the smell inside had deepened into a mix of smoke, mildew, and the faint odor of rotting wood. Fires burned more freely now, fueled by wood gathered from the exposed ground and the skeletal remains of old shelters, but the smoke often clung stubbornly inside when the wind shifted. Men sat closer to the fire for light, and the sense of safety it gave, speaking more often than they had in the winter months, though their words carried the weight of the season they had endured. Rations remained limited. Bread was softer, but spoiled quickly in the damp air, forcing men to eat it within hours of receiving it. Soup was still thin, but now often included potatoes or carrots, a small improvement that was quietly appreciated. Occasionally, a small piece of salted meat appeared, its flavor almost overwhelming after months of scarcity. Water came from rain and melt pools, filtered through cloth and boiled, but it always carried the taste of the ground. Patrols extended farther into territory that had been inaccessible during the deep freeze. The thaw revealed wreckage, shattered weapons, fragments of uniforms, collapsed fortifications, and sometimes more haunting sights: shallow graves disturbed by the melt, bones half submerged in mud. Encounters with the enemy grew more frequent, but remained brief, quick exchanges of fire, before both sides faded back into cover. Nights were no longer dominated by the cutting cold, but the damp crept in with equal persistence, settling into blankets and clothing. The air was alive with new sounds: the soft patter of rain on canvas, the distant croak of frogs, the constant drip of water from trench walls. Dawn came early, lighting the mud-slick ground in shades of gold and brown, and with it came the renewed awareness that the season of stillness was gone. The men had survived the winter that broke so many, but now they faced a different challenge, one where movement would return, battles would resume, and the quiet endurance that had carried them through the frozen months would be tested in the chaos to come. By the last week of May, the landscape bore little resemblance to the frozen front they had known for so many months. The snow was gone entirely, replaced by a thick, clinging mud that stretched as far as the eye could see, broken only by pools of standing water and the jagged remains of trees stripped bare by winter winds. The air was warmer now, carrying the damp scent of thawed earth mixed with the sharp tang of rust from weapons and equipment long exposed to the elements. The wind no longer cut like a blade, but it carried the heavy smell of decay, leaves, wood, and less pleasant things uncovered by the melt. The trenches had turned into channels of sludge, the boards laid across them shifting and sinking under each step. Boots grew heavier with every movement, the mud gripping at them as though trying to drag the men back down. Rifles were constantly in need of cleaning, the fine grit of the wet soil finding its way into every mechanism. The dugouts, though warmer, were stifling with dampness. The walls sweated moisture that pooled on the floor, soaking anything left unwatched. Fires burned hotter, and more often now, their smoke curling against the low ceilings before escaping through narrow vents. Men lingered near the flames, their clothes steaming faintly from the wet, sharing brief moments of conversation that drifted naturally toward the months of winter they had left behind. Rations were still lean. Bread came softer but spoiled within days, forcing men to eat it quickly. Soup was slightly heartier, sometimes thickened with grain or small root vegetables. On rare days, a scrap of salted pork found its way into the pot, its smell lifting spirits across the camp. Water was easier to collect now, but it was often clouded with dirt, needing careful boiling before it could be drunk. Patrols moved farther afield, their paths winding through open ground where snowdrifts had once been chest-high. The thaw had revealed more than just mud. There were broken helmets, rusted cartridges, and the occasional stillness of a figure long past saving. These finds were met with silence, the patrols pressing on without a word. The enemy was no longer just a shadow. Small skirmishes broke out more often, quick bursts of gunfire before retreating into cover. Nights were damp and restless. The sharp cold had been replaced by a clinging moisture that settled deep into blankets and made sleep feel heavy. The sounds of the front had changed. No longer the hollow hiss of wind over snow, but the soft splash of water dripping into puddles, the distant murmur of frogs, and the faint rustle of leaves stirring in the breeze. Dawn arrived earlier now, spilling gold over the sodden ground and glinting off the wet boards of the trenches. Yet with the light came the reminder that the quiet season was over. The winter had been a test of endurance, but the days ahead would demand speed, strength, and resolve. The men could feel the front beginning to wake, and with it, the war that had been sleeping under the snow. Early June brought the final transformation. The mud was beginning to dry in places, cracking under the sun that now lingered longer in the sky. Grass pushed through in thin, defiant blades along the edges of the trenches, and the trees, bare and skeletal all winter, were sprouting the first cautious leaves. The air was warmer, carrying the mixed scents of new growth and old decay, as if the land itself was trying to heal, while still bearing the scars of months buried under ice. The wind was softer now, but it stirred the standing water left in deep ruts, releasing the heavy, earthy smell of the ground beneath. The trenches, once frozen solid, were now lined with boards slick from the spring thaw, their edges curling where moisture had weakened them. Boots no longer froze stiff overnight, but they were still caked with layers of mud that dried to a hard crust by midday. Moving along the paths was easier than it had been in the depths of winter, but the ground remained uneven and treacherous in spots where the thaw had collapsed the earth. In the dugouts, the damp was finally beginning to fade, replaced by a faint warmth that seeped in during the day. The fires burned less often now, not out of rationing, but because the chill no longer pressed in relentlessly. The air inside was easier to breathe, carrying less smoke, though the smell of wet wool and earth still lingered. Men sat outside more often, squinting into the pale sunlight, their coats open and their hands resting idly on their knees. Rations had improved slightly with the change in season. Bread fresher, soup thicker, and the occasional handful of dried beans or grains added to the pot. Water was plentiful, drawn from nearby streams no longer frozen solid, though it was still boiled before drinking. Cigarettes had begun to appear again in small numbers, and their smoke curled lazily into the evening air. Patrols ranged further now, covering ground that had been impossible to cross in winter. The fields were open, the snow replaced by soft grass and scattered debris. Here and there the thaw revealed the remnants of the long freeze, half-buried weapons, collapsed shelters, and the silent forms of those claimed by the cold. These sights were met with quiet acknowledgement, the men moving past with lowered eyes. The enemy was active again. Sharp cracks of rifle fire carried across the open ground, and the dull thud of artillery began to punctuate the days once more. Both sides had survived the winter, and both seemed ready to resume the fight. Nights were different now. Cool rather than freezing, the air filled with the sounds of insects and the distant rush of water. The stars shone brighter without the winter haze, and the men found themselves looking upward more often, as if reminded there was a world beyond the lines. Dawn came early, spilling warm light over a land that was green in places, but still scarred by the months of ice and snow. The frozen front was gone, but its memory was etched into every man who had endured it. They had survived the winter that had broken so many, not by strength alone, but by the quiet, stubborn act of enduring, one cold day at a time. Now, as the season turned, they knew a different kind of trial awaited them.